I'm here today to convince all of you to give up JavaScript forever. Okay. Excellent. So I'm very quickly going to skip over who I am, because I only have half an hour. The only pertinent thing to this presentation is that I make a browser for developers called Polypane in Electron. And that means that I write ungodly amounts of JavaScript all day to make a UI that looks like this. If you want to learn more, I have a table with authentic Dutch licorice that you all have to try. Otherwise, I have to take it home. Or eat myself nauseous, which is the more likely of the two. But it does mean that I really love JavaScript. I write it all day, every day. I really enjoy writing JavaScript. But I also really enjoy writing CSS. And I even enjoy writing HTML. Sorry. There we go. I really enjoy writing HTML. Now, the reason I love writing all three of these things is something called the rule of least power. It says power, trust me. And the rule of least power is one of the core principles of the web, and it means that you should choose the least powerful language suitable for a given purpose. Now, on the web, this means preferring HTML over CSS, and then CSS over JavaScript. Because your JavaScript can break, it can fail to load, it takes extra resources to download and parse and process. It can very easily exclude keyboard users and people using other assistive technologies. And the reason for that is that JavaScript is an imperative language. And that means you tell the browser how to do things step for step for step. And if one of those steps is wrong, your browser just gives up. It's like, I don't know what to do, I'm not going to do anything. CSS and HTML, on the other hand, are declarative. And that means that you tell the browser what to do, like, dear browser, please do this for me. And then the browser goes and figures out how to do it. That means your browser will do the heavy lifting. And that means your end user will have a better experience because the browser can do a lot of stuff that you can't. Now, of course, your CSS can also fail to load, but I know that each and every one of you writes perfect semantic HTML, and that means your websites will just work. Now, in recent times, both browser makers and specification writers have ported a lot of functionality that previously needed JavaScript over to CSS and over to HTML. They've really been listening to us and implementing the stuff that we say we as developers need on the web. So that's what we'll be going over today. But what I want you to take away from this is that once you learn something, you'll never have to learn it again on the web. Because we have this contract that anything you build for the web is going to continue working. The web is backwards compatible. So anytime you learn how to implement something in JavaScript, you can just keep doing that for decades, and it will work the same. But that doesn't mean that it's currently the best way to build something. Very frequently, there's a better way. So the techniques that I'll be showing you today are cool, and that's why I'm showing them. But what I want you to take away is just because you know something needs JavaScript, that might no longer be true. So you can make better websites if you check those assumptions every now and then and try to relearn some of the things you already know. So let's get started. It's going to be a bit of a grab bag of features. So some are small, some are large, some are old, some are new. You might know some of these, so feel free to take a power nap, and then I'll wake you up again with something flashy and new. So let's get started with something that we've probably all implemented at some point, custom switches. So when implementing custom switches, we often reach for a JavaScript solution. We add a bunch of divs. We handle click events and the different states. But instead of doing that, let's build one based upon an ordinary checkbox and the checked pseudo class in CSS. So this is the HTML we're going to use. There's a label, and inside of it is an input. It's pretty simple and functional. So at this point, we're basically done. But of course, we don't want to make our designer cry. We have to do a little bit of work. But the neat thing here is that even with just these 4 lines of HTML, we're already providing a ton of functionality. So I forgot to do one thing, and I'll very quickly do that, which is have a huge cursor. So, oh, this is very confusing. Right, so if I have an input inside of a label, the browser knows that this input is associated with the label. So I can click this little tiny square to toggle my checkbox. But I can also click anywhere else in the label, and it will also toggle the checkbox. The browser does this for me. We've instantly, already with just HTML, made our form easier to use. But of course, this doesn't look right. So we're going to add a few lines of CSS to fix that. I'll wait a bit so you can all transcribe the CSS, so you can take it home and figure out how it works. All of this CSS doesn't really matter. It's just like boilerplate to make some rounded corners, etc. But there's one line of CSS that I do want you to focus on, and that is appearance none. So in the browser, there are certain things that are called replaced content. So that's form controls and images. What the browser does when it renders your HTML is it takes the space of the form element or the image and it leaves it blank. And then later on, it replaces that with the image or the form control. So the image obviously is a different resource, and form controls historically have been provided by the operating system. What that means is that your entire element gets replaced. If you have a before or after pseudo elements, those are part of the element, so those get replaced as well. And that's why things like images and form controls can't have before and after pseudo elements. They might be initially there, but then the browser replaces them and they're gone again. With appearance none, you can tell the browser, hold on, please don't replace my form controls. Please let me design it the way I think the form control should be designed. And then your form control is not replaced, and it's just a fancy div with all the proper accessibility hooks. And that means that if it's no longer replaced, we can add a before pseudo element. So that way we can have our input as the background of our custom toggle, and the before as the thumb, the little round thing. And because the HTML is still the same, you can click it and now it's checked. Trust me, it's checked. Okay, we might have to do a little bit of extra work. So to make that change visible, we can use the checked pseudo class. Now the checked pseudo class will match whenever the regular checkbox would have shown the check. So now as I click, what happens is that the checked attribute of the input changes, the checked pseudo class starts to match, and I can adapt my styling to that hook. And that worked great. But we need to do a little bit more work. So we'll add an outline to the toggle when it's selected by the keyboard, but not when we click it. For this, we can use the focus visible pseudo class. Now, it works like focus, but only when someone uses the keyboard instead of the mouse. Because when you use a mouse, it's pretty clear which element you're interacting with. It's the thing you're clicking. That's pretty clear. If you don't have a mouse, you need to know in some way which element is selected. So if I now start interacting with this element with my spacebar to toggle the input, which again is something the browser gives you for free, there's no key down handler, you can see that the focus visible starts to match, because it knows the element has focus, but it's not clicked, it's not focused by a mouse, but by a keyboard. And we can add this really nice outline. Now, if you've designed out or worked with outlines in the past decade, you've probably done outline none. Because outlines historically on forms have been these ugly dotted black borders that are rectangular, whereas your form controls might be nice and round. Well, as you can see, outline has had a bit of an upgrade. Outline now follows the border radius of your element. And with outline offset, you can also offset the outline, either outside of the element or even inside of the element. So you can really style this in a very nice way. Now, lastly, just something I want you to start doing now is instead of doing outline none, I want you to start doing outline color transparent. What that means is that rather than the outline not being there because you've hidden it completely, the outline isn't there because it's transparent. Doesn't matter for you. Until someone uses high contrast mode on Windows or forced colors. If you use forced colors, all your colors get shrunk down to a limited palette of a user's choosing. By setting outline color to transparent, that outline color will then be overwritten. And because the outline is still there, but it was transparent, it will now become visible again. And you will have additional accessibility for people in forced color mode, without you having to do any work and without you having to compromise your design. So I don't have time to get into forced colors extensively. If you want to learn more, I wrote down everything I know about forced colors on that link, polypaint.app/forced-colors. Or you can ask me afterwards. So just to illustrate that things really go from CSS or from JavaScript to CSS to HTML, in the latest Safari technology preview and in the Ladybird browser, you can now add the switch attribute to an input with a type of checkbox, and the browser will render this input for you. So you can actually scratch out all that CSS you just wrote down again, because you only need to know the switch attribute once support starts landing in other browsers as well. With that, you can just select the thumb, the little circle, or the track, and style that with much simpler CSS without needing to go through the appearance none stuff. That's pretty nice. On to something a little bit bigger, in-page transitions. So when moving from one section of a page to another section of the page, browsers jump by default, and this can be jarring and disorienting. It's much nicer to scroll the user to the new location, because then they have sort of an idea of where they are on the page, how far down on the page they are, if there are any cool sections that they scroll past that they want to go back to. And in the past, we might have used jQuery to do that with just a few lines of JavaScript. But of course, it wasn't just a few lines of JavaScript. It was just a few lines of JavaScript API, and then hundreds and hundreds of lines of JavaScript on the back end of that. And we can replace all of those lines with a single line of CSS. Scroll behavior smooth. This tells the browser to always scroll smoothly when navigating to a fragment identifier or an ID on your page. And that means that every internal link is now magically upgraded. And rather than you having to loop the scroll position and animate it yourself, the browser takes care of that. It will figure out how long the animation should take, how much CPU power is available, how fast the scroll should be, what the easing curve should be. The browser takes care of that, and that means the animation is always snappy. Just like that. Now, quick aside, you can also trigger smooth scrolling in JavaScript, so you don't have to give that up. You can pass it as an option to all the scroll functions, so scroll to, scroll by, etc. However, not everyone enjoys smooth scrolling. For most people, jumping from one part of the page to the other part of the page is the annoying part. But if you have vestibular disorders, it's the scrolling that actually poses the problem. It can make them nauseous and unwell, and that's not great. Like, you don't want your website to make people nauseous. They don't buy stuff when they're nauseous. So browsers have a way of catering to these users with the prefers reduced motion media query. And the way to implement this is to set the accessible experience as the default experience. So by default, we don't have smooth scroll behavior, but only when the person indicates that they don't mind motion, because they haven't set the prefers reduced motion to true, do we add smooth scrolling. So now we have native smooth scrolling for the people that want that, no smooth scrolling for those that don't, and we're not shipping any JavaScript. That's a great start, but in the real world, we have real-world constraints, like a header. So what if we want to scroll a header, but keep headroom, if we want to scroll to an element, but keep headroom for a header? And make sure that it doesn't overlap the thing we just scrolled to. Well, CSS has a solution for that too, called scroll margin. Scroll margin works just like a regular margin, but is only applied during scroll. There's also scroll padding, it behaves the same. So now, as I scroll to my target, you can see that it left some space below the header for me. Now, if I scroll back to the top, there's no scroll margin there, and you can see that it ends up at the top of the page, because that's what I asked it to do, but I still have to scroll down if I'm a real human. So that definitely beats measuring the height of the header and then subtracting that in your JavaScript for your scroll position. Now, as a finishing touch, what if we want to highlight our target in some way to give it some extra prominence so that it's really clear that you're going to this part of the page? Now, we could use JavaScript to add a class that targets that element and then play an animation that way. But there's a purely CSS solution for that too, called the target pseudo-selector. So when an element matches the fragment, which happens as a result of clicking the link, the target pseudo class will be active, and that means that your CSS will apply and will get a nice transition. Or at least I think it's nice, your mileage might vary. So now we've built a way to smoothly scroll to a specific portion of the page while highlighting it, and while keeping space for any headers and the rest of your UI, all without JavaScript. Now, on to two elements that we often saw with JavaScript that we can also just use HTML for, accordions and modals. So having an accordion on your page can be very helpful because it keeps your content organized by showing the titles of sections and letting the user expand the ones that they enjoy or that they want to read more about. Now there's a pair of native HTML elements that does exactly this, the details and summary elements. By default, all the contents of your details element are hidden except for the summary. And by clicking the summary, you can reveal the rest of the content in your details. Now usually what you'll want to do is you'll have a bunch of these, and the first one should be open, because otherwise the user doesn't know that the thing's open, right? Well, you can just add the open attribute, and then the details will be open. Now if any of you write something like React, you'll look at this and you'll think, great Kilian, now it's just open forever, because there's a prop there and it doesn't change, so great job. Luckily, that's not the case, because the open attribute in HTML is called a live attribute. And that means you can set it initially, but the browser will update it for you. So if I close it again and I inspect it with my elements inspector, the open attribute will be gone because it's not open. The browser updates this for me. Now, in terms of styling, that triangle is a marker pseudo element, and it's probably the one your designer will want to get rid of, because it's this triangle and it could be another triangle. Or it could be something entirely different. you can use CSS to style it, though it only supports a subset of CSS because the marker sort of has to be in front of the summary. And if you add positioning to it, the browser will just ignore it because you don't want it anywhere else on the page. But we can, for example, replace it with an emoji. And then again use that open attribute to show a different emoji with just a few lines of JavaScript. Now, a gotcha here is that even though summary is clickable, like a button element and a link element, it doesn't get a different cursor, and there's also no underline. So there's no affordance that tells you that this thing is clickable. So I'm not getting into the only links should have pointer cursors discussion, but I think if you're doing something, or make sure that your summary element has some sort of feedback on hover to let people know that you can click this thing. Now, a recent addition to details is that you can make something called exclusive accordions by adding the same name to multiple details. So when you do that, opening one will close the others. Now, I don't know why you actually want to do this, because it seems very user hostile to me. Like, what if I need to get some information from both? Do I just have to keep clicking back and forth? Feels very annoying. But if for whatever reason you need this, know that browsers support this now. Please don't use it. I mean, it doesn't need JavaScript, so that's nice. Okay, dialogues. So for this next one, I am going to cheat a little because as of today, you do need a little bit of JavaScript to open dialogues. Now, the dialog element in HTML is like a better alert or prompt or confirm. It implements modal dialog for you and takes care of all the accessibility considerations, like keeping focus inside the dialog, showing a backdrop, preventing Z-index issues, etc. But unlike alert, prompt, and confirm, this is an HTML element. And that means that it doesn't block the main JavaScript thread when you have it open. You can just keep doing stuff. So to create a dialog, you use the dialog element. And what you can do in a dialog element is add a form with a method of dialog, and we'll get to why you want that in a bit. By default, a dialog is hidden on the page. It's display none. So to show it, you can call the show modal function it exposes. So if you have a button and we have an imaginary or a JavaScript framework that lets us select elements with the $sign, and we call show modal on it, we can now show the dialog, and I've added some explanatory text for you. Now, this dialog opens on top of everything, and when I mean everything, I really mean everything, because a dialog gets added to something called the top layer. And that's a relatively new concept in browsers, and it's a layer essentially between your page and the screen. And rather than laying out elements on that layer, you can promote a specific element to that layer, and it will just be on top of everything on the page. And that means that that chat widget that you have in the lower right corner of your website will never cause problems again. Now, that form was there to help you provide some additional UI. Because as you can see, there's no close button. Or there is, but I added it. The browser doesn't give you any UI, it's just a fancy div. And you're in charge of providing close and other features. So that's why you want that form there. Because anytime you submit the form, that's a sign for the browser to close the dialog again. Now you can style the dialog however you want. Rounded corners, drop shadows, etc. But you can also show a backdrop that overlays the rest of the page. For example, to dim it to make the dialog stand out more. To do that, you can add the backdrop pseudo class and just set a background and backdrop filter. The browser will make sure that it fills the entire viewport, that things don't scroll away, etc. All these things that you've encountered before when building your own dialog. the browser solves this for you. Now, very quickly, there is a new thing called the starting style add rule, and that lets you animate in elements that aren't yet in the DOM or aren't yet in the top layer. So now I can have my dialog fade in. The way this works is browsers, when you add an element, they don't know where to animate it from, because they just added the element, so that style is the first style that the browser knows about. And with the starting style rule, you can tell the browser, well, you know, that's my endpoint, but before that, I want you to quickly set opacity to 0 and transform to scale this. And now the browser knows how that it can animate from A to B, because you've provided it with A and B rather than just B. Now this isn't in Firefox yet, but I hope it will be soon, because it solves a lot of problems. Now we can animate elements in as they enter the DOM. So all the things I mentioned up to now, except for the very last one, is available in all browsers today. But I wanted to give you like a very, very quick overview, because I only have 5 minutes left, of some upcoming features. Now each of those could be a full presentation of their own, so I'm not going to do any of them justice, but you know, if one of them sounds interesting, write it down and look it up later. So field sizing is available in Chrome, and it changes the way inputs and text areas are sized. So normally inputs and text areas have a fixed width and height, and if you type into them, they start scrolling or wrapping, etc. Very often, you want an input that just sizes to the content. And if you've ever built this in JavaScript, you know how annoying this is to copy out the context, add it in a div, make sure that the styling of the div is exactly the same as the input, measure the div, then set the size of the input again. That's not great. This is a single line of CSS. And it works for inputs, and it also works for text areas in 2 dimensions. So that's very nice. So, we're at the interactive portion of this presentation. Who here has implemented their own custom select or drop-down? You all did a terrible job. But it's not your fault, because that's the best you can do on the web currently today. Now, the select element has a ton of accessibility and interaction features that you might not know of, and that might also, or that also aren't properly replicable in JavaScript. But the select element itself is also kind of sucky. It doesn't let you add icons. It is very difficult to style. If you want a different triangle, tough luck. That's where customizable selects come in. So customizable selects let you change the appearance of a select, kind of like how we did with the custom switch at the start of this presentation. And now each part of your select element is a regular HTML element that you can fully style. You can activate it by setting the select and the picker of the select, which is the drop-down, to appearance base select, which still works the same, but you can see that it looks slightly different from the normal select, because the normal select is provided by the operating system, and this is just fancy divs. But it still works the same. But the select itself now becomes fully stylable. So I can do things like have the picker or the drop-down be a grid layout. And that works fine. But what also works fine is all my accessibility and interaction. So I can use my arrow keys to go through these. I can use space to select it. I can open it and then type the first few letters to automatically select one of the options. You can even add images to this. Now, this is still in pretty early development. It's available in Chrome for testing. It's also available in Polypane. So go and play with it, and hopefully we'll have it in the very near future. I'm going to skip over this one. I'm just going to show you that it's there, scroll-driven animations. Again, this works in Chrome only, though the latest Safari technology preview that came out this week also supports it. And all of this is purely CSS animations based on the scroll position of any random element on your page. So it's very, very powerful. And again, way too much to get into in this talk. So if this is interesting to you, go to scroll-driven-animations.style. So those are all the things you can do in modern browsers that no longer need JavaScript, and some that you'll be able to use soon. So I hope you love CSS and HTML a little bit more after this. Thank you.